I've known Paul for a number of years. Paul was one of the original architects of InfiniBand. He's gone on to do a number of important things since then. He was the one that developed the original Rocky spec. He's now leading the development of the Rocky 2 spec. You'll be hearing more about that during the course of this workshop. He's also the co-chair of OFA itself. That's happened since the workshop this time last year. And he's the co-chair of this new OpenFabric interface working group, along with Sean Hefty, who just walked in. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Paul Grun.
Good morning. I think my official title in the OFA is Vice Chair, and I think that means that I'm in charge of Vice, but I'm not sure. I want to just quickly introduce what you're going to see in the workshop in the next couple of days. We did this last year as well. We started out by talking about what we were going to talk about. Then we had the workshop, and then we came back at the end and talked about what it was we did talk about, and found that to be a very effective mechanism for moving the OpenFabrics Alliance forward. We found ourselves kind of stuck last year, up to the workshop going, well, how do we move the OpenFabrics forward, OpenFabrics Alliance forward? And it seemed like that was a really good way to do it. So we're going to do that same general approach, excuse me, this year. So this will be sort of one bookend, and then there's another bookend coming at you on Wednesday afternoon. And I have no idea what we're going to say because we haven't seen the workshop yet, so we'll see how it comes up. So just a couple of notes to myself about things that I wanted to be sure to mention while I'm standing here and have your attention, since it's first thing in the morning. The workshop theme this year is disruptive technologies, which explains why we had Dr. Sterling speak. He led us in with that exact topic. And when we talk about disruptive technologies in the context of the OpenFabrics Alliance, they really fall into two large buckets. There are, hardware kinds of open disruptive technologies, and I kind of think of these as things that are coming at us. As a software group, an organization that produces open source software, there are things that are coming at us all the time and to which we have to respond and should respond and need to respond. And I put those in this category of hardware, even though that's not really a good way to do it. And the two big things that are going on, at least in that area, that we're going to be talking about in the workshop in the next couple of days are non-volatile memory. You'll see there's a block of 4 talks associated with non-volatile memory, which gives you a sense for the importance with which some of us are terrified about the emerging topic of non-volatile memory. Then there's a panel addressing processors. And the idea here was, as processor architecture evolves over time, that has some sort of an impact on us as I/O providers. And the question is, what is that impact likely to be, and how do we begin preparing for it? So that's the hardware side of the disruptive technologies. The other part is the software side. And as I say here, this is the stuff that we're doing to ourselves. And what I meant by that was, it's fine for the OFA to produce open source software, but we got to keep moving. And if we don't keep moving, pretty soon we're nowhere, anywhere. So we need to keep this thing going forward. And the way to do that is by continuously disrupting ourselves. And you'll see a really good example of that at the workshop today. And this is something that's been going on for the past 8 or 9 months inside the OpenFabrics Alliance, this whole business of the OpenFabrics Interface Working Group. So anyway, this is good disruptive stuff. Some people sort of object to the expression disruptive technology because it has sort of vaguely pejorative or sinister overtones. Nothing sinister about it. This is really good stuff. So that's the general theme for the workshop, disruptive technologies. There are a couple of really interesting talks coming up. There's a block of talks on Wednesday morning. It turns out that exascale radio astronomy has the problems that we tend to try to grapple with in spades, maybe worse than anywhere else in the known universe, so to speak. And by pure serendipitous coincidence, there's a huge exascale radio astronomy conference going on this week, right down the street here in Monterey. So we've spoken with some of the astronomers there and asked them if they would come and talk with us about the problems that they're facing. So that should be a pretty interesting elaboration on what this exascale problem is. So we'll see that Wednesday morning. And then again, last year there was this whole business about, how do we think about the OFA more broadly and move it to where we want it to be? So the other thing that I wanted to talk about just briefly was, how do we act on the imperatives that we defined at last year's workshop? The text is really small. I don't expect you to read it. Excuse me. But just by proof, this is a slide from last year's Wednesday session. And the end result of the workshop last year was that we agreed as a group that we were going to undertake an objective to try to drive the OpenFabrics Alliance forward, which sounds great, but nobody really knew how to do that or what it meant. That's what we spent a good bit of the time last year working on, was trying to figure out how we were going to move the OFA forward. And of course, things have progressed significantly since then. And you'll see that reflected in the way that the agenda for this year's workshop is organized, which is really what I'm about here. I want you to try to understand what the framework was, so as we walk through the sessions at this year's workshop, it all kind of hangs together and makes sense to you. This is a slide that Bill Magro had put up last year. It was sort of a money shot from his presentation, which was actually given Monday morning. And there were really two things that he said that really jumped out, I think, at all of us. One was this business about application-centric APIs, which we've since transmogrified into this expression, application-centric I/O, which is the art and science of creating I/O that maximizes application efficiency. That's the definition for it. And then the other one was this idea, and this was the real challenge to us, I think, as an organization. What if the software led? So rather than wait for, network designers to come up with a new network and then lay some APIs on top of that and then pass it over the wall to application developers, what if we turned that paradigm on its head and instead had application requirements start driving the definitions of the APIs from the top down as opposed to the bottom up? Of course, no one knew how to do that either, but it sounded good. Meanwhile, there'd been something going on in the TAC. How many here know about the TAC? Anybody? The OFA TAC? The TAC is a technical advisory council. It's the guiding technical body behind the OFA, and it tends to hide in the shadows, but we're going to change that this year. You'll hear more about the TAC from Tom Stachura over the next couple of days. Anyway, in fall of 2012, the TAC had begun an effort to revamp the canonical, as I call it, OpenStack architecture slide, one of which I think we're probably all familiar, and it's probably pasted on most people's walls. But anyway, there were some problems with it, and it needed updating, and it was time to sort of fix it up and clean it up and move it forward. And some of us started saying, wait a minute, really all we're doing is if we do that, we're tinkering with the plumbing. That's all we're really doing is, tinkering with the plumbing inside the OpenFabrics Alliance. We're not really talking about how well it works for applications. We're not really talking about how it maps onto networks all that well. We're talking about what the plumbing is inside. Does DAPL connect with verbs, and what way does it do it, and so on. Interesting stuff, but almost a little bit beside the point. We really were just rearranging the deck chairs, and we started talking about, updating the canonical software stack slide. What we really needed to do was to figure out what kind of deck chairs are needed. So we took a step back and said, well, there's something else that we need to be doing here. And so we started looking at that canonical slide. And the more we did it, I'm going to go back here. The more we did it, we started, is there a laser on this thing, Bill? Yeah. Aha. We found ourselves focusing on this part up here. This is the application layer. More and more and more, that kept coming up as the issue. And pretty soon we started talking about, how do you map those applications that we claim to serve to some broader set of classes of applications, if you will. And what are the focuses of foci of what the OpenFabrics Alliance ought to be doing? And the novel conclusion that came out of all of this, and novel is in quotes, you're supposed to chuckle at that, was that we really ought to focus on applications as key drivers in developing OpenFabrics software. I mean, what an epiphany, right? It only makes sense. If you're going to try to drive applications forward, you probably ought to let applications drive you forward. And that's what drove the agenda for last year's workshop, as it turned out. Really what we had done, although it was sort of hidden at the time, but we had broken the sessions down roughly along these 4 boxes here. So there were sessions about distributed computing and sessions about data storage and access and sessions about sockets and so on. That was what sort of drove the structure for last year's workshop. So let me give you an example of how we've sort of applied that same paradigm with respect to the OpenFabrics interface. By the way, the OFI WG recently underwent a name change. So if you hear some of us stumble over the next couple of days, we used to call it the OpenFabrics or Open Frameworks Working Group, OFWG, and we recently renamed it to the OpenFabrics Interface Working Group. But it's sort of instructive to look at where that working group emerged from. For those who don't know, it was chartered in August of 2013, about 9 months ago. And you're going to hear a lot of talk about this over the next couple days, so don't panic here yet. And it was really driven by this focus on applications as a key driver. So the TAC had done its work and really focused on applications as a key driver for OpenFabrics software going forward. Then there was this challenge that Bill Magro gave us that said, if you're going to do that, why don't you start from the top down anyway? And that led to the charter for the OpenFabrics Interfaces Working Group to come up with interfaces that meet the needs of applications. Again, not a very astonishing observation. It's just we'd never thought of it before. Which led to the question of which applications. Applications is a big word. There's a lot of them out there. How do you grapple with this space called application? Is it all HPC? Is it all, what's going on at Berkeley? Is it all enterprise? What is it? No one really knew. Another one of these questions we didn't have the answer to. So let's go back to that stack diagram again. And if you sort of blow up what's in the application layer there and abstract it a little bit, they really fall into 4 broad categories or classes of applications, if you will, even though I've shown them as 5 here. And I'll say why that is in just a second. But starting from the top, IP-based, so traditional applications that run over sockets. We need to be able to deal with those. And we've seen our sockets emerge in the past couple of years, and SMCR emerged in the past couple of years. And there'll be talks about both of those at the workshop this week. Various MPIs. This has been the classical bread and butter for OpenFabrics Alliance. How well we've done that is open to debate, but we're going to fix that with the OFI WG. But nonetheless, it's a class of applications that we need to deal with. Oh, and by the way, I didn't mention it. That's the message passing side of distributed computing. What about the shared memory side of distributed computing? So that's part of that same class of applications. Then there's block storage and file storage. So I've lumped those together, although I haven't lumped them together in this picture. But in my mind, anyway, they together comprise one class of applications, which is data storage and data access. And the last is something that I've labeled here, clustered database access, which really transmogrifies into something about data analysis. So this is the starting point for what applications we're talking about when we want to address these things in the OFA going forward. So you group them together into common interests, and this is sort of the picture that you wind up with. This is the same picture you saw on the previous slide, but blown up so you can read it. And they're sort of important, so let me go through them. Starting from right to left, distributed computing. Distributed computing is sort of my moniker for the thing that generally pays the bills at the OFA and has for a long time. A lot of it has to do with HPC and very high-performance exascale computing, and how do you scale out. And historically, we focused on message passing, so that's the classic MPI applications. But we are beginning to ask ourselves questions that people have been asking us to ask for years, and we're just now getting to, which is how do you do this in a shared memory kind of environment, like let's say PGAS. So that's one big class of applications. Next big class of applications, data storage and data access. That includes file systems. So Lustre is already here, but what about object storage? Are we doing anything there? What about block storage? We already have ISER and SRP. Are we doing the best thing as far as an API goes to support block storage going forward? What about distributed storage? And what about storage over long distances, a topic that seems to keep coming back for conversation whether we like it or not? More and more people need to access their data over very long distances, sometimes with moving it, sometimes without moving it. So that's the second broad class of applications. The third is a group that I call sort of data analysis, which began with structured data. So Oracle has been a big player in the OpenFabrics Alliance for a really long time, an example of a structured database approach. But what about this emerging unstructured data world? And I just won't use the expression big data here, but that's what we're pointing at. What do you do about big data from a data analysis perspective? And last but not least, on the far left-hand side there, what about legacy sockets applications? So here are sort of the large groups of classes of applications. And by the way, there's nothing sacrosanct about this. I made it up because it seemed to make sense. People are more than welcome to argue with me about whether we've got these things grouped in a way that makes sense or not. What we needed was a starting point and a way to get going. So feel free to suggest a different grouping if that makes more sense to you. Just something that lets us get our arms around the applications that we're trying to serve with OpenFabrics software going forward. And that leads to this idea of a slightly different way of looking at how OpenFabrics software is developed. Historically, This is called the OpenFabrics Alliance Developers Workshop, and historically we focused on ourselves as developers of OpenFabrics software. What I'm suggesting here is a broadening of that view. Rather than just developers, let's think about it as creating interest groups, if you will, to coin a phrase. And by interest group, what I mean is really 3 communities at least, and there may be more, of people who have an interest in any one of those classes of applications that I mentioned on the previous slide. So you might say that there are 4 interest groups. And this is a very informal thing. There's no structure to this, and you shouldn't expect to see calls to join the data storage interest group, nothing like that. It's just a way of thinking about ourselves and trying to draw in more input from the outside beyond just ourselves as a developers community. So people who comprise an interest group are, of course, OpenFabrics software developers, sort of the core of the matter, if you will. Then at the top, consumers of OpenFabrics software. Who are the people who are actually trying to use this stuff to do something with it? The classic example here is the MPI community, who for years has felt sort of disenfranchised from the OpenFabrics Alliance. But when we reached out to them in the context of the OFI working group and said, we really want to hear what you have to say, boy, did we hear about it. And there's going to be some of that at the workshop in the next couple of days as well. So this is a group that really wants to engage. They really want us to do the right thing, and they want to help us to do that. Another community that may be part of this so-called interest group, to the extent it exists, are those who are actually deploying OpenFabrics software. So, you know, I make a distinction between people who consume the software and people who are deploying it, in the sense that deployment means people who are building data centers, people who are building storage systems, things like that. People who are actually trying to do real work using OpenFabrics software. And to some extent, this is the iBug, the users group that's been emerging over the past couple of years, driven by Susan Coulter. This idea that there's a community of people out there who are trying to build data centers that use this stuff but really get lost in the process. So the basic notion here was, is there a different way of looking at us as an organization that makes us more responsive to what applications actually need to drive ourselves forward and results in a better set of APIs or a better network software, if you will, network software stack. And again, on the right-hand side, I've summarized what I think to be those interest groups, and you'll notice they map one for one on those classes of applications mentioned on the previous slide. So that brings us to this year's agenda. Again, there's large discussions about disruptive technologies. I think this will be very interesting. There are 4 sessions about NVM. One of them, NVM as a disruptive technology. One of them, what's going on in SNIA with respect to the NVM programming model. There's another one from IBM, what they're doing with NVM today in storage. And a 4th one, an application of NVM in burst buffers for high-performance computing. And you'll see, if you look at the agenda, many topics that are related to those 4 broad classes of applications that I talked about. So this is the point. When you look at the agenda for the next couple of days, don't just look at them as a whole bunch of sessions. See if you can spot the relationships between them, because they are there. In fact, there's a little color coding that shows them that way. That was how the agenda was driven for this year. And of course, scalability, we already heard Dr. Sterling's keynote last night, and then the radio astronomy community coming to talk to us on Wednesday, I think will be helpful as well. So as with last year, that was the opening, that was the bookend on the left-hand side. Wednesday we'll come back and try to close it and see what conclusions we can reach from what happens over the next couple of days.